Are you getting ready to make a change, to let somebody go? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today.
How do I know when it is the right time to fire someone?
You know, that's a big question right there. You know, it's interesting as leaders, we oftentimes feel a loyalty, a sense of dedication to our people, and letting them go is emotionally hard. Well, not always, but sometimes. And so this question comes up really in almost every training session that we do in organizations is, how do you know when it's time to cut the cord? How do you know when it's time to let somebody go? And really the only way you can look yourself in the mirror and be at peace with letting somebody go is when you can look yourself in the mirror and ask this question: have I, as a leader, really lived to my responsibility for this individual? Have I done everything in my power to help them to succeed, and they have shown an unwillingness to learn, to grow, to become better in their role, and ultimately to succeed? And to answer that question, we have to ask ourselves, have I really been the caliber of coach, of mentor, of leader that this person needed me to be? So have they failed me, or have I failed them? I remember many years ago working with a gentleman, his name's Ron Crone. And Ron was a wonderful Southern gentleman, 27 years in a management role. And it was interesting, when this question came up in a training meeting Ron was in, he said, he goes, in 27 years, he goes, I've never had to fire anybody off of my team. He said, it's not that I've never had any turnover, but just that I've never actually had to fire anybody. He said, anytime I got to that crossroads with somebody where, I knew that they just weren't making the grade. He said, what I would do is, he said, I would just take them for a walk out in the park. And I would shoot him. No, he didn't really shoot him. He said, I'd take him for a walk in the park, and we'd find ourselves sitting on a park bench, and I would just look at him, and I would say, it occurs to me that you're not going to be as successful as you deserve to be here in our organization. He said, and I just wanted to ask you, what do I need to do to help you to get to someplace where you can be as successful as you deserve to be? He said, it was an amazing thing. When I had that conversation with people, what happened? He said, because about 40% of them would literally tender their resignation right there on the park bench. He said, because they knew they weren't succeeding, they knew they weren't happy, and they just didn't have the courage, if you will, to make the change. And so he said, I was able to give them a little nudge in that regard. He said about another 40% of the people, he said they would think about that conversation, but over the next 2-3 weeks, he said I'd get an email or a letter with their resignation in it. He said in the final 20%, he goes, sometimes it would take a little bit longer. He said, but they'd ultimately come to the conclusion. Now there was a reason why that worked for Ron, because Ron wasn't a good or an average coach or mentor. He wasn't a good or average manager or leader. He was really a great one. He was one of those people who lived to his responsibility for his people. So he was able to look in the mirror and know that, what? I didn't fail them. They failed them. That's a very, very powerful thing to realize. I remember many years ago working in Prudential, and there was a gentleman in one of our meetings who I found out that we were doing a training meeting in about midweek, and on Monday he had sat down with his HR business partner, and they had decided that they were going to let somebody on the team go at the end of the week. So he said, I've got to go to this training meeting this week, but he goes, on Friday, let's sit down with this individual and we'll let him go. And so about 6 months after this, he's telling me this story. He said, I sat in the training meeting that week, and he goes, at the end of the first day of the class, he goes, I was really questioning myself whether I lived my responsibility for this individual. He said by the second day of the training, he goes, not only did I realize I hadn't lived to my responsibility, but I was literally developing a plan for what I needed to do better to live to my responsibility. He said, at the end of that second day, I reached out to that HR business partner. I told him to hold off on scheduling the meeting that Friday with that individual. Well, again, he's telling me this story 6 months later. And as he's telling me the story, he said, that guy that I was getting ready to let go of that week, he said, that guy right now is the #1 salesperson in North America for Prudential. And I was getting ready to fire him because I thought he had failed, when in reality, I was the one who failed as a leader. So very important distinction, knowing who failed. Was it us as a leader? Or was it them in their unwillingness to grow, learn, and develop?